2:01 p.m. and we've got a really good turnout. So if anybody straggles in late, my apologies, but off we go, I think. For anyone who doesn't know me yet, my name is Catherine Fletcher. I coordinate the Cybersecurity Oxford network. So anybody who does something vaguely cyber related somewhere in Oxford hopefully is known to me. And if I haven't met you yet, I'd love to. But I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, who's Kanika Thapar. I've got official biography here, which is that she believes in the power of empathy while building products. She started her career coding on firewalls, then founded a startup in the consumer mobile marketplace space, where she led product, customer acquisition, and fundraising, and then returned to security. She has a deep passion for cybersecurity, design, and ecosystems, especially the startup and investment ecosystem. She currently works as a director of product at Yubico, which I'm sure you guys are in this business all aware of, for authentication hardware. In her spare time, she helps Oxonian founders through the Oxford Entrepreneurs Network and the Oxford Angel Fund, and is always looking for the next game-changing cybersecurity product. So answers on the back of an envelope at the end of this if you have something to sell. For now, when we get started, I'll turn off my camera and my microphone just so that I'm not a distraction, and also because I've got really terrible home Wi-Fi and I don't want to take the call down with me. But if anybody wants to leave their camera on, you're very welcome to do so, but you're not required. But keep your mics off just so it's quiet. You know this by now. We'll save questions till the end, but if you do have an important clarification question as we go along, feel free to use the chat box. And if it's important enough to break into the conversation, I'll stop the speaker. But otherwise, we'll go through the questions at the end. Normally, this is where I talk about fire exits. I guess just look around your room and be aware of your situation. And I'm really excited to hand over to our speaker. Take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. I hope you can hear me okay. If you could confirm before I start.
Yes, you sound great.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to kick off the first cybersecurity mini deep dive that is focused on the business and industry applications of the authentication market. Thank you for joining from whichever time zone you're joining us today. And as Catherine said, please feel free to ask questions in the chat that I'll try to take in the end. And I would be very happy to open the floor towards the end for a live Q&A. So a little bit about me, I'm Kanika Thapar, also go by Kanika Thapar Mehta. I matriculated Oxford in 2012 for the MBA program. And as my background, I've spent over a decade in multiple cybersecurity roles, from software engineer to product manager. And currently I'm responsible for all client software and validation SaaS services for Yubico that builds YubiKeys, the hardware authenticators. And today I just want to share my thoughts, my 2 cents on what I think has been the path of the authentication market and where we can expect a lot of opportunities going ahead in the next 3 to 5 years. Please feel free to email me if you have questions or follow-ups, or find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. So today I want to talk a little bit about the market shifts, see what are sort of the attack vectors that have led to the explosion of the identity and the authentication markets, what have been solutions in the market, and what has sort of been their security posture as these solutions have played out over the last 15 or 20 years. And then finally, a little bit about use cases and future trends. So that'll sort of be my flow for the day. This past year, when we asked enterprises or even the public sector on what's been accelerating the digital transformation, the answer, surprisingly, is not a person or even a technology. A lot of the market shifts, as we know, have been driven by world events of the last 12 months, which have seriously impacted multiple industries, but nothing more so really than cybersecurity, because of the hacks and breaches and phishing attacks that we've seen take multifold over the last 12 months. So like, this statement needs no introduction. We know that employees around the globe and students are now working from home at rates that are unprecedented, have never been seen. The rates that were supposed to accelerate over 10 years have actually accelerated in just 6 months. And for the statistics fans amongst us, there was a survey done by CSO Online last year in the retail and wholesale vertical, where they're saying they've seen an 18x or 18 times as much more work in 3 months alone. So that's kind of been the explosion in certain verticals. You might have heard that Google announced that their workforce will not go back to work until July. Twitter said the same. Salesforce has jumped on, and all the other major enterprises are offering some sort of a remote flexibility going into the future for good, forever, not just because of the pandemic. So there was this report done by Meritalk, in which a majority of the agencies, 83% of the agencies, are increasing multi-cloud adoption to support this telework and this explosion because of COVID-19. However, while adoption is increasing, as we know, the cybersecurity threats have been exploding. So nearly half of these respondents, 42%, said that their cyber strategies cannot keep pace with these multi-cloud environments that have popped up, not just for remote work, but for access as well. On the federal side, federal agencies, of course, have also really increased their dependence on telework. Initially, they would not be allowed to work more than 1/3 of the workforce in federal would not be allowed to work remotely due to multiple reasons around compliance or requirements of the job. And that number is expected to have gone up to 90% last year alone. But as people work more remotely, right, and with this added wrinkle of the explosion of Internet of Things in every shape or form, there are multiple points of entry for attackers to come in. As we know, it's not as simple as just building a moat around your network anymore. Because of this, we're seeing breaches, not just because of internal threats. We've seen a tremendous increase in breaches because of employee negligence, because of ignorance. So that's been a real challenge. But really, on the defense side, what needs to evolve, or what's changed significantly, is how network operations centers, or NOCs, and security operations centers, or SOCs, are need to evolve. So the traditional ones are pretty much dead in the water now. The next gen ones that are popping up, where a lot of opportunities lie, are all around a centralized view of incidents, like how much can you automate with lower false positive rates? How much can you do how much security focused case management are you really able to do? And how much real-time collaboration can you do across products and analysts that are working on this from all over the world to find threats and minimize their impact and do quick retrospectives and cleanups? That's where a lot of the opportunities lie because of the issues that have arisen in the last 12 months. So like I said, hacking and phishing has been in the news non-stop the last 12 months from every vertical possible. We've seen severe threats to utility companies, which can put lives at risk. We've seen attacks on security products themselves, which is very alarming. We've seen state actors doing some pretty terrible phishing attacks and ransomware. So it's been pretty prevalent everywhere, and the agenda has been surprisingly very mixed. So historically, what we would see is a lot of the times the agenda was driven financially by all the threat actors. But now we're seeing such a big shift of not just financial, but also just political gain or comparative gain between countries, between companies, that has caused so much of these to pop up to sort of try to minimize the growth or profits of a certain entity. We've seen a lot of that pop up. So these threat vectors that we see, right, in school, in business, in government, all of them are kind of raising fresh questions on what is, like, the solutions and tools that we have. What is the security of these tools? What is the capacity and scale they can reach before you hit any security implications, for instance? For instance, if you look at employers, right, it's not just can you scale, is there like enough capacity? It's also how many vulnerabilities can these people introduce into the network and into the access that they're trying to do, because not just because of like weak passwords, it can be like poorly secured Wi-Fi home routers. It can be a family member using devices that has computer virus. So endpoint security has become really front and center because of this issue. And then I keep coming back to the government, because while government budgets for cybersecurity have dramatically increased last year because of all these events, their challenges have really increased too. So like I said, like they've gone up to remote work by up to 90%. They're, in terms of compliance, they are the most challenging vertical to build cybersecurity products for, because they're usually only allowed the best of breed, most compliant, and most certified products. And that's something that security startups and security enterprises around the world are highly focused on, because it's a lucrative market, but at the same time, it's a challenge to sell successfully and repeatedly sell into the federal market in all geographies, but especially in the US. So after forming this base and sort of what's happening in the world, getting a little bit more into what the attack vectors are, and then tying it into how does authentication come into play, right? So there was this report done about 18 months ago by Verizon, where unsurprisingly, the top sources of breaches were phishing attacks or stolen credentials. And I'll get into the anatomy of a simple phishing attack, and I'm sure a lot of the audience here is already aware, but the ones who would be new to phishing would be surprised at how simple and powerful a phishing attack can be. And the second one, as we know, is stolen credentials, which is where weak passwords come in, which is where the fact that a password is stored on the server makes it so much more vulnerable than passwordless deployments. And I'll get a little bit into that as well. So phishing, right? The anatomy of a phishing attack. How does phishing happen? It's extremely, extremely simple. And that's why it is so prevalent and so easy to find vulnerabilities. So assume that the victim is me, Kanika. I have a login at a real website called bank.com. And there's an attacker who's looking to gain access to my credentials to make payments or transfer funds. So the attacker will send me a fake link in my email. The attacker would know, for instance, what kind of email I would like to, what kind of email I would respond to. So in this case, they were going to phish it as close to bank.com as possible, and make it sound exactly like how banking emails are. And that's not hard to find. If you open an account with that bank, you would know what kind of email this would sound like. And it would ask me to, for whatever reason, for security reasons, or there's a new message or something, it would ask me to enter my username and password that I had set up on bank.com. Now that goes to the attacker because it's actually not going to bank.com. It might be going to bank.com with an M. I don't know that. I didn't pay attention to the email. There was no validation of URL. So I relayed my username and password to the website. And what the attacker did was stored the username password, but then also sent it off to the real website to try the login. Now, my bank has thankfully set up an SMS or a mobile push, some form of weak authentication. And I'll get into it a minute why I'm calling it weak authentication. And that SMS code and hitting an OK on the mobile push app that you might all be very familiar with now goes to my actual phone, Kanika's actual phone. Now I think, okay, I'm logging into the real website. Nothing funny here, nothing fishy here. I go and submit that. But really, that's gone back to the attacker because I was communicating with the attacker's URL and not bank.com. So the attacker has access to both my username, password, and my second factor authentication, which was an SMS code or mobile push, and has successfully now logged in to the real website. And I am none the wiser. I have no clue that this is what has happened. The attacker has complete access to my credentials, successful login for both first factor and second factor, and now can wreak havoc as he or she may please to. So this is how simple a phishing attack is and how weak authentication that is prevalent all over the world in every vertical today using an SMS code or a one-time password or OTP or a mobile push onto the banking app that you have or your email if you have it. So if it's a magic link is how simple this attack is because it does not do URL validation. So this kind of forms the base of what gave rise to a lot of the new strong authentication mechanisms that I'll get into now. So phishing is the real issue we know, and as very commonly it is said is any MFA is better than passwords alone. So based on the last example, hopefully you see that that is not the case at all. All MFA is not created equal. And MFA historically has been just a check mark in organizations or even consumer behavior saying, oh, I have an SMS set up, I'll be safe. No one can phish it because I have my phone with me to verify that this is me trying to log in. So what has kind of been this evolution journey, right? And I've kind of spoken to most of these buckets already, except for strong authentication. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a little bit of an echo coming. I hope everyone's muted. Please let me know if someone unmute and let me know if you feel the echo too.
I heard the echo, but it stopped, I think.
Okay, great. Maybe someone just joined. Okay, no worries at all. All right, so the first bucket, right? We know that username passwords deployed everywhere. There are a lot of usability gaps in this. The biggest one being the factor that weak passwords can be easily accessed during a breach in your data center or cloud. They're also costly because they need this amazing server-side infrastructure to maintain and sustain and update constantly every 6 months, which also results in a lot of support calls for enterprises, making it extremely expensive. And then they're one of the easiest targets for credentials, credential hacks, right? The second that came about that is now probably the most pervasive bucket is, like I said, the simple SMS or email-based push or mobile. So now while this does tick the checkbox, it is not really purpose-built for security, because users just use existing technology stacks that are still vulnerable, still have software attacks, still might have endpoint issues, and they simply sort of paste the second factor on top and just hope and pray nothing happens, and they're happy till they're not. So this bucket is seeing serious attacks, which has kind of forced strong authentication to become front and center in the market finally. So strong authentication has been purpose-built for security. It's been built by security experts to make sure that there is no attack surface, or as minimal attack surface as possible. It's in almost all cases that we'll talk about, it is phishing resistant. It may not require even client software or network connection, and it's driven by public key cryptography. So the main two security protocols in strong authentication really are around U2F or FIDO2, and I'll introduce that in a minute, and the smart card technologies. Those are the secure ones. So I've kind of touched upon all these, but I wanted to lay them out as an evolution. And if there was one slide outside of opportunities that folks remember today, I would love it to be this slide, because this can give you a sense in one slide of where we've been and where we are headed. So as you can see, in these buckets, they're kind of played out on not just how use cases have evolved, how the platforms have evolved, how apps have evolved, but also the security posture has evolved moving from left to right. So you can see that, like I said, SMS was just a checkbox, and it worked while it worked till it didn't. And then OTP tokens and mobile OTP push and auth OTP also here is like super popular. But in the middle bucket, like we saw, and then the strongest forms are smart cards, which is one of the biggest used form factors out of all of these in the federal sector, which tells you how strong that is, that uses public key cryptography. And similarly, on the lines of public key cryptography, we also have the FIDO authentication through multiple devices. And what those devices are, I'll talk through as well. So all these authentications that we see, right, and what is phishable, what's not, where we are headed, the goal has sort of been over the last 5 years or so to move towards passwordless. And you might have heard that it's a buzzword. We see very varying reactions when we position this to the federal sector or enterprises or financial sector on how to go passwordless, because passwordless means many different things. And in the security industry, most people know that it's more of a buzzword than a simple implementation reference architecture to implement with certain protocols, certain operating systems, certain browsers. So it's been a moving target for multiple reasons. Not one of them being the fact that every sector sort of defines passwordless in a very different way. So I'll give you an example of how we define it at Yubico. At Yubico, a passwordless solution, authentication solution, is simply a solution that does not use passwords. Now that seems very simple, but that sentence is very, very loaded, because when you don't use passwords, are you allowed to use biometrics? Do you use the PIN? Does it mean the password, the PIN is going over the network or not? Because at the end of the day, the way I would think about passwordless is my password traveling over the network and hence introducing all vulnerabilities across the network, as well as being breached at the server? And if that none of that is true, if what I know and who I am when I'm authenticating is within my reach, whether it's a biometric or a security key or a voice generation system, as long as the identity is with me and a password is not traveling over the network or getting stored on the server ready to be hacked, that is a passwordless solution in my perspective. So that's why when you see this, you'll see OTP, which is symmetric encryption. So you set up an OTP at authentication at registration, and when you authenticate, you send the same OTP over the network that the server has, and it validates. Now there might be checks like salts there and making sure it's incrementing when it's OTP, but at the end of the day, you still have that server side vulnerability. We know same is for SMS, and that's kind of led to, like I said, a lot of the evolution of going to smart cards and FIDO U2F, right? And I say U2F because they're kind of two flavors or versions of FIDO called FIDO U2F and FIDO 2, FIDO U2F and FIDO UAF, and I'll get into that. So it's really a journey. The first question really we ask is, why do you want to go passwordless? That's what we ask it to enterprises. And what does passwordless mean to you? Because those two questions can shed a lot of light into what the enterprise or the government sector is trying to achieve. Where do they see challenges? Are they just simply trying to enable biometrics and PINs and move away from OTP? Are they not even on a second factor journey yet? Are they just on username passwords and would like to build a passwordless flow? Are they super advanced and would like to build something that the identity vendors are now calling usernameless flow, where you have a device that the first time you register, they would know that this MacBook is owned by Kanika, and she has biometrics like a fingerprint set on her MacBook. So the next time I log in, it will not even ask me for my username, as long as I'm using strong authentication like FIDO2 to authenticate with biometrics, and on the back end, authenticate to the FIDO2 server. So that's kind of the spectrum of solutions where that is the most user-friendly and most cutting-edge adaptation of authentication, where you don't even have a username, forget a password, that we're seeing identity vendors promote a lot last year, like ForgeRock and Okta. So coming back to this a little bit, why do stolen credentials continue to be such a nuisance, right? There's a saying in the security community that you might have heard, that security is only as strong as its usability. And it makes no sense, but it's extremely true in the real world, because when we're deploying to 60,000 employees in an enterprise, the first 2,000 that are security savvy, like NetOps, like the NOCs and SOCs, the IT admins, the engineers, they're going to be they'll be very happy to adapt the most secure solution. But as you deploy to non-technical audiences and companies, if the solution is not super simple to use and super simple to troubleshoot, they will fall back to the lowest possible security measure that is available. And unfortunately, in multi-factor authentication, that in most cases defaults to SMS. So a lot of organizations deploy these amazing smart cards, security keys, they deploy OAuth, TOTP, but they have to give that option to fall back to an SMS or a phone call, which, as we know from recent attacks in the last few months on companies like Twitter, is also very, very phishable. Even if it's not an OTP, you can actually call and get the same information from employees by panic or by inducing fear. So because of that, usability has been, user experience has been as important, if not more, for the adoption of different authentication mechanisms. And that's one of the reasons that mobile push, even though so insecure, has seen an explosion of adaptation. And if I remember this right, Mobile Push, the revolution was led by Duo, that is now acquired by Cisco, that does not use FIDO2, it uses auth-TOTP, but they made it so extremely simple and reduce the number of seconds it takes to authenticate that they very easily went to the top of the market. But that's where the smart cards fall short. They are the most secure because they use public key cryptography, but they are extremely hard to bring up for an enterprise because you need these incredible backend infrastructures that are very challenging to bring up and are not as simple as bringing up a validation server for OTP, for instance, or bringing up an auth or TOTP network. So when we think about multiple dimensions on which MFA is evaluated, either by CISOs or by even influencers that we see, like directors of identity infrastructures or security architects that are in the SOC team, we can see that, like, from a security perspective, when they start to position their smart cards and security keys, like I've said a few times now, really stand out. But because of things like user experience, SMS is still so widely adopted, even though it has so many challenges around security and portability, because as you shift phone numbers, you might need to do that expensive support call and make sure that your phone is successfully connected, for instance. So a lot of this has been setting the stage of why FIDO2 now, and why FIDO2 and why FIDO2 now. So FIDO2 was a security paradigm that was created by a lot of top companies like Microsoft, Google, Yubico was involved through the FIDO Alliance to understand and sort of handle authentication on these two metrics that I just talked about, that it has to be highly secure and phishing resistant, but it has to be super easy to use, and it has to be privacy preserving. So first, to get in strong cryptography, like I said, it uses public key cryptography. Since it does an origin check, so you cannot get phished by a bamp.com with an M instead of a bank.com. So it does origin checks to make sure that the pairing is done with the right URL, and it cannot be phished, because once a user registers an authenticator to a service like, say, facebook.com, it is bound to that original URL, and it cannot be triggered to log into a fake website. So it makes it very effective as a defense against phishing attacks. The other thing that is very big on FIDO2 is user presence or verification. So it means that I am here and I am admitting that I am trying to authenticate. So a lot of these vulnerabilities are because of remote attacks, but making sure that you have, like, you touch a sensor, or you do Windows Hello for Business for Microsoft, where you do a Face ID through that, ensures that there is a real live human behind the computer, and this is not a Trojan attack or a remote hacker. The fourth, which is very big on FIDO2, is that you attach sort of one identity to one app or one service, so that you're not worried about shared secrets across multiple services. The fifth is sort of a pro and a con. The pro is you can do secure backups by using different CTAP2 authenticators with self-service, but then of course it also introduces that extra overhead at the time of onboarding. And finally, the biggest reason, according to me, that FIDO2 has become center stage in the last year or so is this incredible support that is coming from browsers and operating systems that was lacking before. So Apple is on board, Microsoft, Google, they are very active participants in making sure that their browsers and operating systems are catching up to how do you authenticate, how do you register FIDO2 keys, how do you change fingerprints, for instance, if you need to, for a biometric capability, and how do you add keys, how do you delete keys from service using just the operating system or the browser. So that removes a lot of dependencies of going into different apps and setting it up per app. So what is this FIDO2 technology that I've sort of been talking about? I want to take a couple of minutes and walk everyone through it. So at its core, FIDO2 is super simple. It consists of CTAP, which is the client to authenticator protocol. And the other piece is the WebAuthn standard. So together they help to enable authentication where users can identify themselves through cryptographic authenticators. Again, these can be biometric, security keys, whatever you're using. It can be wearables, anything, to a trusted WebAuthn remote peer. So that can be a website or a web app like facebook.com or bank.com. And the WebAuthn API, it's nothing, it's just a specification where, like I said, Google, Mozilla, Microsoft, a lot of people came together, a lot of companies came together. They built this specification that lets you register and authenticate users using public key cryptography instead of a password. Simply, that's all it does. And it's the reason kind of it's so strong is because first, like I said, it authentication is mostly backed by a hardware security module that can be stored in your phone, or it can be stored in a security key or your laptop, wherever you have a secure space that cannot be hacked. The second is the key pair is only useful for a specific origin. So that kind of makes sure that there is no URL phishing happening. And then a third capability is sometimes authenticators can also provide a certificate attesting that this is me, I'm verifying my identity using the public key, which is called attestation. And it makes sure that it's not coming from a fraudulent source. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what FIDO2 phishing enables. From a flow perspective, it's two steps, as with most authentications. There is registration and there is an actual authentication flow. So registration is simple. You bring in an authenticator. You will try to authenticate to an application or a browser that I would like to add. I would like to add this security key to twitter.com as a secure form of authentication for myself. And that information is relayed to twitter.com and through WebAuthn to the WebAuthn API, and that handshake happens. And similarly, authentication would just be coming back and saying, hey, you had registered this. This is me, and the proof is in the user identity that and verification that I'm doing through one of these cryptographic authenticators. That's sort of how simple it is. And the server will use this public key to at the time of authentication to retrieve and verify that this is the key you registered with when you were registering. So that's kind of what the FIDO2 protocol enables, which is in two parts, CTAP and the WebAuthn API. Now, how does this help with passwordless, right? How does FIDO2 sort of enable passwordless? So one is single factor, which is the one that I was talking about, where there's absolutely no password. You take the authenticator and you touch and tap. And this can also be like the usernameless flow that I talked about earlier. So as an example, on a MacBook, if you have set this up for login with ForgeRock, for instance, as an identity vendor, you simply will use your fingerprint to authenticate using FIDO2. Where you will not submit any username or password. But really the bigger, most prevalent deployment that we've seen is around multi-factor authentication, not just single factor. So you might add the authenticator with sort of a user touch and a PIN. And the reason it's passwordless is because a password travels through the network, whereas a PIN does not. And I want to get into that detail a little bit to explain how PINs and passwords are different, because it's one of the most common sources of confusion that we see in our enterprise customers. So passwords, like I said, it's a shared secret between a user and a server. So it's very, very susceptible to breach, and it requires these changes, which are extremely expensive on support calls if you, for instance, exceeded your 6 months of changing a password or you've forgotten your password. PIN, on the other hand, is local to the device. So it is not traveling over the network. For instance, if I have a PIN set up on a security key, the PIN is validated and stored on the security key itself to unlock the public key that will be sent over the network. So what travels is the public key, which, as we know, is not susceptible to threats, and the PIN is just used to unlock that private public key pair. So that's why the PIN is extremely secure. And what we're seeing now as a new trend is the PIN is also getting replaced sometimes or added on over a biometric feature. So again, biometrics can be many things. It can be fingerprint, it can be voice, it can be face ID that might be used. So kind of bringing this together into real world applications and trends, before I open it up to questions, I want to go over high level what are big authentication use cases that have really driven the market in the last 5 to 7 years, and then get into what, according to me, just personal opinion, where the opportunities are going to lie in the next 3 to 5 years. So a lot of our focus is enterprises, but these use cases also apply to federal and finance and specific verticals as well. What we've seen is customers most commonly consider authentication to achieve three goals. It can be to protect application login. It can be to protect computer login, which is a big use case that even I wasn't aware of till I joined Yubico. And then remote access. So a lot around VDI and stuff. So that's kind of what we've seen as be these really three big buckets. And when it comes to application login, it basically means seamless integration with all the different identity providers that you see, from Microsoft Azure to Okta and Duo. And they might provide a lot of capabilities in mobile, or they might have native applications to do this. But the authenticator will kind of enable the authentication piece and bring it back to identity is kind of what we've seen. So getting into the first one, the most common one, which is access to cloud services and applications. So again, a lot of this is mostly driven by IAM integrations, and IAM are the identity and access manufacturers for companies such as Okta, ForgeRock, Microsoft, like I said, Ping Identity, that usually offer this entire suite of protocols and services around identity. But there's this big piece on that, which is authentication, which a lot of times they might do themselves, but a lot of times they also partner with other vendors to do that, are providing novel solutions that they may not have built themselves, or where they see a new need for. They also do something called as adaptive MFA, or adaptive authentication, which is becoming very, very popular, that all these vendors offer, where authentication, these IAMs basically add additional context. They have a different pricing tier, and they add additional context-based authentication, such as the geolocation of the device, or any device context or device health that might be required, that Duo does, or threat insights from other parts of the network that might influence your authentication posture for that device. Risk-based step-up authentication. An example of risk-based step-up authentication can be, I usually authenticate with my username, password, and an OTP, for instance. But then the IAM engine identified that my phone should use a stronger authentication when a doctor is, for instance, prescribing medicine to her patients. So at that time, they might require a stronger step-up authentication to use a smart card or a security key, for instance. A second big use case is around protecting VPN access, that we see it as kind of another layer of defense to VPN, which is a lot of times a lot of legacy solutions are at play. So multiple reasons why we've seen a lot of interest in this. First is, of course, to protect against credential theft, against simple username, password, to add that extra layer. But also we're seeing a lot of need emerge because of regulatory compliance. And finally, the need to sort of have visibility into devices, because this is the endpoint software at the end of the day. So that's a big reason also that we see remote VPN be a big use case come in, where authentication is an add-on. A lot of innovative solutions happening in this space, like Radius as a service is something that we see, where they're like a cloud-hosted network of Radius servers that are provided. They're pre-configured, that organizations around the globe can use and integrate into their solutions, whether workers are working remotely or not. And this is a simple, scalable way to add VPN. And a vendor here that jumps to mind that does really well is Jump Cloud. no pun intended, that's making a big play at this, and they integrate with a lot of MFA vendors. And finally, a third big use case that we're seeing is around virtual desktops. And this has also created a lot of challenges on how and on what do you relay when you're doing virtual login versus what stays on the device. And again, a lot of deployments here we're seeing around smart cards. This can be SSH access. This can be complete RDP access. Lots of use cases here, lots of demand and deployments that we've seen emerge for authentication. So where is sort of the future headed, right? As a summary, we're moving from phishable authentication to phishing resistant authentication. And in most cases, what that simply means is smart cards or FIDO2 technologies that we see today. But they will take a while to build out, and there's a strong case that is made for them now, thankfully, because their guiding principles were to hold the highest level of security and phishing resistance, but make sure that the user experience is there. And for wide scale deployment, the IT costs are significantly down. And a lot of the big vendors are completely behind this. Microsoft predicted last year that we would have crossed 150 million passwordless users about 10 months ago. And from here is where a lot of the new opportunities emerge, where we see FIDO2 adoption and FIDO2 interest giving rise to a lot of startups that are playing in FIDO2 as a service, for instance, where they provide a backend service for WebAuthn and allow multiple authenticators to be registered on the client side and provide this entire service that integrates with your existing identity engines. We're seeing a lot of that. So that is kind of the passwordless authentication that we hear about in both workforce as well as customers. And I want to distinguish the first two buckets that might look very, very simple. But when we're talking in the identity market, which is really the big umbrella under which authentication falls, workforce identity is simply sort of governing the data and system that corresponds to employee bases. Whereas consumer is more bringing business to consumer use cases, where a bank might want a customer, not an employee, a customer to have the highest level of security. But when it comes to consumer, user experience plays an even bigger role than workforce, because workforces can be mandated to follow authentication mechanisms, whereas consumers have to believe in the usability and security of the technology to see widespread adoption. So that's kind of the distinction that a lot of identity vendors are also now making. It means very different things when it comes to deployment as well. For instance, consumer or customer identity is, given that it's relatively very new, it's seeing a swing towards more newer ways of adapting technologies like FIDO2. Whereas workforce sees the whole spectrum that we've seen from SMS to smart card to FIDO2 all the way. So it's very different how these markets are being targeted by identity and authentication vendors, but they're both growth markets. If I were to bet in terms of a pure percentage of numbers, I would say the customer market might grow faster than the workforce market, but the scale of workforce is still extremely big. And finally, the third point that I made a few slides ago as well is there are huge opportunities in how do you bring these legacy systems that had username passwords or simple VPNs deployed to, or even SMS as a second factor deployed. How do we bring them to the other secure side, and very specifically to FIDO2? Because one really big ask that we see is we have huge smart card deployments, which, as we know, are very secure, but they're very, very cumbersome and expensive to manage for the enterprise. How do we bridge that from using smart cards to using FIDO2? That's a big, big legacy shift that we've seen sort of enterprises want. And I think there are a lot of startups that are focusing on this specific migration use case. Enterprises are also very focused. Like when I see a legacy, it can also mean from on-prem to cloud. For instance, Microsoft is heavily focused in their hybrid strategy on how do they move on-prem AD to Azure AD. So they've built a lot of hybrid solutions, and they're accelerating that move as fast as possible. And that's where a lot of the opportunities outside of pure passwordless authentication lie. So those are some of my thoughts on where the market's going. I'm very happy to take questions, and again, very happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a couple questions posted in the chat. Before I go to them, I'm going to give everybody a chance to start posting any additional questions in case we should go through them in any particular order. And while I'm stalling, I'm going to also trail, we have not yet announced this, but we will be hopefully beginning to start thinking about Oxford University alumni. And some of you here, I think, that are attending this meeting might be yourselves alumni. So if you're interested in that, please write me back. You can either drop your information in the chat or just write inquiries at cybersecurity.ox.ac.uk. And we've had one question already, which is, first, would you be willing to share the slides? So that's up to you.
I can definitely share most of them. Let me just maybe do a run, and I'll be happy to send back my deck to share if it helps. Sure. Absolutely. And Catherine, should I start taking questions from the chat then?
Yeah, would you like to, or I can curate them? It's up to you if you'd like to just scroll through. The first one was from Daniel H2, round about 1427, and he was asking about delegation of trust.
Yes, so absolutely agree. Yes, it's a delegation of trust, and a lot of the times the question that we're getting is, how do you bootstrap trust? And I think I'll go on a little tangent here, but since we were talking of opportunities, and I want to give a flavor of opportunities out there, when you're bootstrapping trust, we've seen a lot of companies like Onfido emerge, and Onfido, I believe, is an Oxonian startup as well, that are helping bootstrap trust, beyond which then you can either start trusting the device that this is the correct user, like you said, Daniel, or you can start trusting the authenticator that you're using that may not be attached to your device. So the next question is also from Daniel. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah. So do you think the average consumer may stick to a password manager which does do URL matching versus true passwordless due to the ease of resetting a password and moving to a new device? Password managers, we've definitely seen a few asks, even for us at Yubico, where there's interest in integrating with password managers. Password managers tend to be one of the most secure apps, as is their business. For instance, they integrate with a lot of our SDKs. We have a very big customer base in password managers that use our mobile SDKs to integrate to successfully work with YubiKeys, with any security key, really. So they put in the effort to do that. And the distinction, I don't know if you made that distinction, Daniel, but I'll make it. The consumer plays very big on password managers. I think they're just emerging on the enterprise side now. So yes, consumer play will be pretty big on password managers. Enterprises, we're starting to hear, are also moving to big password manager deployments, which might sort of enable URL matching. I haven't seen it. I don't very closely follow the space, but I think if they're bringing in URL matching, that will absolutely be an option to provide phishing resistance. Okay, so someone else has given a good source of a FIDO2 paper. Catherine is asking, from Yubico, purely from economic perspective, do you have any study available? Study on the ROI of authenticators? Yes, I can definitely. We have multiple studies. I'll have to just find if we have a public-facing one. We definitely have studies we share with our customers. So, Catherine, if you, happy to share that.
Thank you.
Public-facing one, yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't. I think I got flagged in it, but it's one of our attendees that asked the question.
Okay.
But yeah, but is it?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say keep going though, because there are more questions.
Okay, So the next is widespread use of continuous authentication for passwordless authentication for customers realistic? So if I understood this question right, by continuous authentication, you probably mean authenticating every time. And if I understood that right, that's where adaptive authentication comes in to kind of reduce the pain. What that would do there is it might authenticate you for 10 hours on a certain geography, for instance, and say you're good to go. Very similar to SSO almost. And you would only authenticate again when that window has crossed or a risk metric has changed. So I think if that's what you meant by continuous authentication, that's where adaptive authentication comes in. And that's what's getting positioned a lot by identity vendors. Okay, so someone else is also asking for slides. Catherine, you asked something else also around vulnerability disclosure recovery processes. What's the inside story of the FIPS key vulnerability? Who found it? How did they find it? What was the reaction within Ubico? I can talk about this probably offline. We're a security company, so I mean, and I've been in security roles before, but honestly, I've never seen as security-minded company as Ubico. Like everyone takes every vulnerability risk, even a security related to usability, to heart. So that's what I can share here, that we take this extremely seriously, and the whole company bands together to make sure our customers are not impacted.
Well, I don't know if you're able to answer this question, but can you at least say, was it something that was brought to your attention by like a user had said, I had this weird thing that happened, or was it an external security researcher that might have reported it as like a bug bounty process, or was it your internal security researchers that found it? Are you able to share that information?
So Catherine, honestly, I don't know.
Maybe you can. It's okay.
Yeah, so I don't know because I don't work on the FIP side, but yeah, I can. Usually, it's all the options that you said. Mostly, it comes from security researchers, and that's why we're able to patch it pretty quickly. Very rarely does a severe vulnerability ever come from consumers, and we do bug bounties as well. So it's really all of the above, like you said. Usually, it's all of the above on how we find and patch vulnerabilities. It also comes from customers. So this is public, so I can share this. We had a small vulnerability in one of our open source software that was found by a customer last year that we patched and made sure it's covered for everyone else. It was a validation open source server. So it comes from customers too sometimes. And I'm not sure I completely answered your question, but that's
thank you. That's pretty good going. Thanks. Okay.
Nimrod is here. I don't know if he's still here. He's a friend. Hi, Nimrod. He's also a fellow Oxonian. And his question is, does the authenticator work with mobile devices? Yes. By authenticator, if you meant YubiKeys, then yes, YubiKeys have their own authenticator apps, Ubico authenticator apps, and they can be used to work on the OAuth protocol. And a lot of apps have also integrated directly with our SDKs, so you can use the YubiKey within the mobile app, like the different password managers, like I said, like Morgan Stanley, like the Brave browser app, and so on. Someone got a new key. Great. Okay. What are your thoughts on recent password managers having trackers in these? What vulnerabilities do you see these highlighting? So again, I'll be honest, I don't follow password manager updates more beyond the fact that they integrate with my SDKs, my product line. So that's where I'm involved. But on tracking, the one thing that I will say is a lot of our prosumers and security expert users and evangelists over the last few years say they love our product because we don't have tracking. So we don't have metrics in our apps. All our client software is simply downloadable. It does not call back home to any cloud service. So it's a big for hardware authenticators, it's a big selling point where we can claim that we're not calling home. So we're not even competing with like the mobile push apps that are completely mostly connected and even do a cloud backup of secrets, which kind of defeats the purpose. If you ask me, if you're doing a cloud backup of secrets, unless you've done it in a very unique way, it's going to reintroduce all the issues of passwords that we've sort of discussed so far. I think that's all the chat questions, Catherine.
Yeah, I think, and you've been a very, very patient guest, I have to say. So thank you very much. If anybody else, we've got to hang on a follow up from Vaslav there, if you like. He was replying to the vulnerability. I don't recall what was the issue as it was a few years back, but there was an encryption issue or something with YubiKeys. Basically, you had to apply with your local distributor and they replaced the key. I think that was the FIPS thing, actually, wasn't it?
Okay, maybe. I mean, what I didn't share is I've only been at Yubico for 1 year. So if it was before my time, then it's even more unlikely that I would know about the vulnerability. But I can definitely dig up more information if folks are curious.
Yeah, and I suppose it's this, for anybody listening, this is not an official product endorsement or anything, but I do, as a matter of fact, have a YubiKey and I use it.
Great.
And yeah, no, it's, well, come on.
Always
I mean, in
very
this line
happy
of
to
work.
hear that.
It was my New Year's resolution a couple of years ago to set up MFA for as many accounts as I possibly could. So I bought myself a YubiKey and I've got my Google Authenticator on my phone as well. And yeah, it actually works quite well. So it integrates nicely.
I'm so happy
and
to hear that.
Somebody's asking about
another question.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Daryl's asking about how big a part you see biometrics playing in the future. So it's a very interesting question. You might have heard that we've also announced a biometric key for later this year at Yubico. All other hardware vendors also have either announced or already have launched the first versions of biometric keys. I think biometrics are they're going to play a very, very big role in the future. I think they're slowed down because of the pandemic, because if you think about practical applications, right, a lot of the verticals, industry verticals these days either have a mask on, so Face ID doesn't work, or they will have gloves on, like factory workers, warehouses, healthcare, so fingerprint cannot work. So they keep defaulting back to PIN or other forms of authentication. So I think that's been a real deterrent. The momentum that we were seeing in interests and deals that wanted biometrics keys was insane before the pandemic. And that has slowed down just a little bit, where they're careful that we absolutely want biometric keys for the usability. But at the same time, they have to be wary about a lot of these use cases where gloves and masks are coming into play, where fingerprints and Face ID are going to be a challenge, whether you do it on a laptop or you do it on a security key. So that slowed things down a little bit. But at the end of the day, a lot of these biometrics, they are basically simply replacing PIN when you look at highly secure mechanisms. In fact, a lot of times, even to reach a biometric, you still have to type in the PIN. So biometrics are not more secure, they are definitely more usable. And from that perspective, I think they'll be very they will see an explosion. Unfortunately, not so much this year because of the pandemic challenges, the practical challenges of a facial recognition or fingerprinting.
I think, yeah, everybody's saying thank you, and I definitely want to echo that and say you've been lovely to have, and it's been great having you. We'd love to have you back sometime, I'm sure. In the meantime, thanks. And yeah, in the meantime, I'll drop my email address in here really quick here, so anybody who wants it can have it. Isn't it? There you go. Hope I typed it properly. So if anybody has any questions or wants to follow up, feel free to just drop a line to that email address. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you guys for future events.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. I'll see you around. Bye.
Bye, Catherine. Thank you.